Can we turn the other microphones off? Okay. Thank you and welcome to Group 2's Collaborate presentation. I'm Rob Garvey and it's my honour, I suppose, to kick off this morning. Hopefully everybody will have a good day and I can set the good tone for the rest of the day. In terms of just moving the slide on, there's our title, and as you can see there, the names of the other group members, and you'll see that we're from 3 different institutions, and we've used this to good effect in our research, and you'll hear more about this in our presentation as we go through. We're focusing very much on enhancing student learning through peer and self-assessment in assessed group work, and the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to provide some context around assessed group work before handing over to Angela, who's going to provide further detail around peer and self-assessment, and then Ariane will sum up with some important conclusions and recommendations. Our aim here was very much to recommend how student learning and fairness of assessment can be enhanced through peer and self-assessment in group work. We set out to evaluate the use of assessed group work, analyse the implementation of and the issues relating to peer and self-assessment, and then appraise the current and future practice regarding mechanisms to assess individual contribution. So, we identified a question at the start, so hopefully the polling and I can publish some results and you can all see that there. So there's quite a few people that don't actually use any individual assessment, but then an indication there that there's a fair bit of dissatisfaction, so hopefully we can enlighten a few people as we go through. So moving swiftly on, assessment ultimately lies at the heart of the student experience. It should be a core skill of the lecturer to effectively evaluate a student's work and provide a clear indication of their progress. If the assessment is not working, it's not benefiting the student, and you need to change the assessment strategy. And when that assessment involves group work, the challenge really becomes about how you establish effective mechanisms to assess individual contributions, which is what we'll look at now. So why assess group work? Well, according to Phil Race in his briefing on group assessment, if you don't actually assess group work, students won't engage with it. In terms of how you assess it, well, there's been a proliferation of different assignments involving group work, and with that and numerous different methods. But the key thing here is that whilst assessing the product of group work is relatively straightforward, assessing an individual's contribution to the process and performance of the group work is much harder. And when we looked at the issues, our research sort of mirrored very much of our own experience, not both as a lecturer and those within our discussions with students. And that's namely to deal with the product versus performance in groups, whether you accept that the different contributions should be rewarded differently, and if you do, how you do it, as well as free riding. And we also need to ensure that any assessment is valid, reliable, transparent as required by the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, of which they cite the peer assessment as a fair means of achieving these objectives. So wrapping up on my part, James and others sort of neatly summarised the key aspects for assessing group works, indicating that you need to make a few choices. And these are whether you assess the product of the assignment, the process of working together in a group, or both. What the assessment criteria should be, and who determines them, whether students are involved or not, whether lecturers and students share the responsibility for applying the assessment criteria and determine the marks using peer and self-assessment, or again, there's a combination of both. And then finally, the distribution of the marks, whether it's one group for all, a group average, independent marks for each student, or again a combination of both. And as you can see from the quote on the right, Latine identifies that there is a reduction in individual effort when working in groups if there is no mechanism to identify the contribution of individuals. And with that, I'll hand over to Angela.
Okay, good morning everybody. Well, as Rob was saying there, when we talk to our students, they feel the only people who really know what their contributions are the students themselves. themselves, not only the lecturers. So peer and self-assessment is vital because it involves assessment of students by other students, but also students' own performance to assess group work. That gives students the opportunity to look at assessment as learning because they're researching topics with each other, assessment for learning because they're developing skills like judging each other, negotiating their position, and assessment of learning through the marks that they're given. And as you can see from Brown, Rust and Gibbs on the right there, peer and self-assessment really does help students develop a life ability to make judgments. This is really a necessary skill in any professional or study going forward. Looking at the next slide, there's quite a lot of benefits that our students have identified in peer and self-assessment. The main ones on the left probably that students just really get an increased understanding of what the standards are they need to meet if they've got to assess each other and themselves. And this really improves the timeliness of the feedback and their motivation to work in groups, and a better feeling of accountability and ownership and responsibility of what they're doing. Students tell us if they can mark each other and themselves, that gives them more of a deep rather than a surface learning experience, and as we were saying, helps them develop life skills as well. On the right, many benefits of self-assessment are similar to peer assessment, but I think we see at the top there that really being able to self-evaluate gives you the ability to develop a point of view on your own skills and to negotiate your own position as well, which helps you really identify what criteria you're working to and judge how you yourself meet those standards as well. So really, as Nicola McFarlane-Dick quotes on this slide, someone who can really provide self and peer assessment, their own feedback, because they understand the standard they're aiming for, can then judge and change their own performance and self-regulate themselves in terms of the standard set. And that really is a very strong professional and life skill which peer and self-assessment can give a student. Obviously, there's a lot of approaches to doing this. Even across our 3 institutions, we found numerous variations in approach. One fair approach which students have said they like through our institutions is the sizing the slice approach that you can see here on this slide. So basically, the tutor gives the student a number of pies for each group, and the students then use a formula to calculate final marks to split up the pie between each student. Benefit there is they get a much wider range of marks, but they do obviously have to work hard to get a good mark. They assess their contribution, the tutor assesses their quality. Other things they're usually asked to assess on peer and self-assessment, obviously often the quality of the end product itself, the report or the website, whatever, but then also their contribution to the overall group process and performance, which is very important. So some of those criteria in peer assessment, as we see down the bottom of the slide, include, for example, attendance, did they show up to all the group meetings, quality of their interaction with the rest of the group, and some professional skills, did they help solve problems, etc. So there's quite a few different things that we ask students to rate each other and themselves on. And here's an example from Westminster. This is from Rob's area, where you can see their students mark each other and grade each other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 along a number of categories like regular attendance at group meetings, etc. And this is modelled on Heathfield's methodology, which we reference later on. Students apparently don't like doing it when they're doing it, but once they've done it, they really do feel that they see benefit from being able to rate each other and themselves using this scale. So, it's not all rosy. There are some issues relating to peer and self-assessment. Obviously, we as lecturers need preparation time because we need to prepare good assessment criteria. Students aren't always objective, so we have subjectivity, peer pressure and bullying creeping in. My students particularly are very Q conscious, so they look at assessment backwash and how do they gear their scores to meet the assessment criteria. And other students are clever enough to use calculations to gaming techniques to get the scores they want. Sometimes tutors give limited explanation and training, and then the allocation of marks goes somewhat awry. And some tutors' attitude really isn't always very enthusiastic about this scheme of peer and self-assessment. Overall, however, students do seem to like being involved in peer and self-assessment, and you can see here the variability in the different schemes that we found even across our different groups of institutions. The overall table on the left summarises all the differences, but we've just picked out a few of them for you on the right. So, for example, if you look at the bottom of this table, peer marking is anonymous in some institutions, but not in others. Teachers mark quality and output in some institutions, but students mark that as well as contribution in other institutions. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of consistency of approach in peer and self-assessment. And here are some quotes that bear that out. As you see the bottom right quote from one of my students, I may not have turned up to all the group meetings, but I think my group suck for marking me down and losing me 5% of my coursework mark. But as one of Jason's students says on the top right, you do get different opinions with different approaches, but it does help break the monotony in your own process. So generally a painful experience sometimes, but one very well worth doing in the views of our students. And I'm now going to hand over to Ariana to conclude.
Thank you, Angela. So I will be doing the conclusions as well as some recommendations for current practice and future practice. So group work is increasingly being used in higher education. We know that from our research, and we've also seen it in this presentation. Group work is part of what every professional is likely to encounter, and the skills gained through group work are also often considered employability skills. So assessing group work increases validity of assessment because it makes it more similar to what students are likely to be doing when they start working. As we've seen from the presentation so far, there's a wide variety of different approaches. Within Westminster there were different approaches, and across different institutions the approach was also not consistent. How students actually grade each other, what the criteria are that they use, and whether or not it's anonymous or not is also different, so no consistency there either. Overall, we as a group agree with Gibbs' statement that allocating a single group mark really rarely leads to appropriate student learning behavior. It also leads to free riders, and so the huge potential of benefits of group work are likely to be lost. And in addition, students find it unfair. So our overall recommendation and conclusion would be to assess individual contributions. So I will now look at a number of different ways to make sure that that works. First of all, to say that whatever method you decide to go with, it requires careful planning. It needs to fit into the overall learning and teaching strategy at your institution. And if you are choosing to assess the group process as opposed to the group product, you need to make sure that that is reflected in the learning outcomes, and that peer and self-assessment are also based on criteria that are relevant to the learning outcomes of that particular assessment. Gibbs makes a number of different recommendations. One of them is to clearly divide task components. This may not always be feasible, but where the task can be divided, this is helpful, as Livingstone and Lynch point out that this also is likely to reduce personality clashes. They further recommend to make sure that peer assessment is restricted to judging academic tasks, so things like an essay or a group report. Students are more likely to be familiar with that, but assessing someone's professional skills, such as their ability to negotiate, may be difficult because students may not necessarily have any previous work experience to draw on. Also, to make sure that whatever rating scale you use, that it's anchored in actual behavior. So when we say to the students, interaction is important, what does good interaction actually look like? And perhaps Gibbs' most important recommendation is the importance of a healthy learning climate, or what Biggs calls a theory Y climate. Really, the learning climate will have a significant impact on whether or not there will be any issues with group assessment and peer and self-assessment within that. Where students feel supported and are given and want to take responsibility, it is possible to make this work very effectively. Race does also further recommend to make sure that there's anonymity in peer marking. One way that this can be achieved is to just simply have students put their peer assessment in a sealed envelope. But also he recommends that students take ownership of the marking criteria, so that they perhaps co-develop the marking criteria. He sets out an 18-step plan as to how you might be able to achieve this. So also, similar to this, Bloxham and Boyd point out, spend time agreeing criteria with students. Students need to know how does this actually work, what are the guidelines, and how does this fit within the overall rationale for group work. Include practice activities where possible, so you can give students feedback on their ability to peer and self-assess. Training might be an important thing, especially if students are not so familiar with self and peer assessment yet, or even training in teamwork skills. Further recommendation is to include self-assessment, not just peer assessment, because it makes sure that students can compare how they view themselves and how they assess themselves as to how their peers see them. And what we've heard from Imperial, not just to deduct marks for poor group contribution, but also to allow additional marks for positive group contribution. This is an excerpt from some work done by James McInnes and Devlin. It is actually part of a much longer table, but I just want to point out the last part of the table, marking the process, and point to the fact that in addition to having students evaluate their own and peer contribution, make sure that there are some further evidence that the students can provide. Learning logs might be helpful here, or minutes of a meeting, or perhaps a project plan. And a tutor might even consider to do, for example, an oral examination, or tie in the group work with a final exam to see who's really done the work and who hasn't. Another option might be to ask students to submit a portfolio, as we've also done for Westminster. So these are the appendices we've used. These first ones are to inform our actual presentation and that we've used in the presentation, and these are some additional references that we highly recommend you look at if you consider doing peer and self-assessment in group work. So our final questions then, based on what we've just explained to you, are you likely to change the way you use peer and self-assessment in assessed group work based on our analysis? And you can tick either yes or no. And as the results are coming in, it seems like the majority of you seem to be considering how you could use peer and self-assessment. So I think that is an excellent result. And I would just like to hand over back to Rob, who is going to moderate the Q&A.
Okay. Hi, Gunther. Did you want to say something?
Thanks. No, just to say that noise you all heard was just 15 minutes ending. Almost bang on time, so well done for that. Rob, you can manage the Q&A, but I will pass the microphone around so you can concentrate on the questions.
Thank you. So, who's got a question? If you want to raise your hand, and I'll try and... Right, Raymond?
Hi Rob. Yeah, my question is, what do you do if students disagree with each other's contribution to a group assessment?
That's a good question, and it's always a slightly tricky one. Obviously, one of the key things of working in groups is that you're very much trying to get them to resolve the disputes themselves. If they can't actually get to the point where they resolve the dispute themselves, then you might invigilate some sort of resolution to it. In the examples that have been discussed with me at Westminster, it's happened on a couple of occasions, and in that situation the lecturer in question has sort of taken a line where he's understood both sides of the argument and then got them to resolve the issue after he's invigilated. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Next question. Adam? You have the mic, Adam.
Sorry, I didn't realise I had to press talk as well, but then I should know that by now, having used this system on numerous occasions. But there we are, hey ho. Yeah, I mean, I suspect that the peer marking process in the majority of cases becomes a bit of a collaboration by the students, and we as lecturers are fooling ourselves if we think that ultimately the spread of marks that we end up getting is anything much more than a collaborated decision by the set of students, and all we end up marking on is on the quality of what's issued to us. What do you think about that?
Angela, can I ask you to address that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because at Imperial we have the opposite, that they can turn into a witch hunt. So if somebody in a group hasn't cooperated, then everybody else gives them a really rubbish mark. So A, tutor moderation, as Rob was saying, is very important, but B, we do now at Imperial very much look for evidence, like keeping logs, that people can say, look, I did turn up to that meeting and, you know, I put X hours in and that person put Y hours in. And then when you're moderating, you have got evidence basis for your decision to either, you know, take the mark down or up according to what the students are giving you. And I agree that there has to be some tutor moderation in circumstances where you suspect there's either collusion or witch hunt stuff going on, really.
Thank you, Angela. Any other questions? Alistair? Yeah, Alistair. You need to push your talk button, Alistair.
Hi, this is Alistair. Oh, hi, this is Alistair. Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was just wondering if you'd identified any problems with the peer assessment, any downsides to it.
Angela, can I ask you to sort of reiterate the issues that we identified in the slides?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from a lecturer point of view, it's extra work. Clearly, you've got to set the assessment, you've got to get the students to agree, then you can't just sort of expect them to work it out themselves without any guidance. And yeah, I think probably subjectivity can be a bit of an issue in groups, as you say, but then you just need to get evidence to make sure that that is avoided. And I think, particularly with my students, the assessment backwash thing is an issue, that they look for what they've got to do to get the marks, and then they try and gear it up to that. But at the end of the day, that's not an issue, because in life you know what you need to do to get a report done and all the rest of it, and as long as you're fair and you can prove that you did the right amount of work in achieving what you've done, assessment backwash can actually be quite inspirational as well as being an issue. So I think those are the main problems. We don't really see any gaming going on in most of our institutions. I don't think students have got time to calculate how to sort of get more marks than others, really.
Hi Gunther, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did. I just wondered if you'd come across any arguments in your research for doing the opposite of what you're recommending, which is to give just a group mark. Or did you come across any circumstances where giving a whole group mark made sense?
Ariana, do you want to answer that?
Yes, I will answer that one. I think this is, for me, a good example of what it means to be an autonomous learner and what it means to give students responsibility. Ultimately, I think this is where you have to engage in dialogue with the students and really get a sense of what they feel is appropriate. And if they are happy with the overall group mark, then that is a decision that can be made collaboratively. So yes, there is an argument for that if that's what students want. The whole point of it is not to impose anything, but to co-develop the assessment criteria and the methods of assessing, in my view.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I know that you probably all have lots of other questions, and I for one would like to thank the group for a really interesting presentation. I would like us now just to take 5 minutes, if you would, just to think about your peer marking of the presentation that you've just received, not forgetting that you also had a summary sheet for the presentation in advance, and we've just had the question and answer session at the end. So in terms of the criteria, if we're thinking about a pass, we're thinking, did the presentation meet its intended outcomes, and did it give you an overview of the issue? So if you're thinking about a pass, you're getting an overview of the insights into the issue. If you're thinking about a merit, you're thinking, actually, that was a good, solid understanding of the issues. I've got some things there that I can apply to my practice. And if you think it was outstanding and a distinction level, then you're thinking, actually, that was very insightful. There was a lot there, quite extensive research and reading. And you'll know that the grade categories for those are, for a pass, 50 to 60, 50 to 59, for a merit, 60 to 69, and for a distinction, 70 and above. So what I suggest is you make a couple of notes now of feedback and a grade, and then we'll move to the next room for the next presentation, which is Group 1. Give them 5 minutes to get themselves ready, and at the end of the day you can go back and have a look at your grades and moderate them before you type them up for me and upload them to Blackboard for Gunther and I. Okay, so if you just take a couple of minutes now, and then when you're ready, we're moving to the Collaborate room for Group 1.